Okay, we haven't talked a lot about civil rights yet, and this is going to be the start of discussions that we're going to have really the rest of the school year throughout the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration. It's just a subject that isn't going to go away, and it's going to be very detailed once we get into the 60s. And so it's a very important topic that you understand. Now, when the Eisenhower administration started, it was kind of wide open concerning civil rights. And the issues that Eisenhower is going to have to deal with in the 1950s, as I mentioned, is going to evolve into the 1960s, the 1970s. It's going to continue to today. You know, these people that are kneeling during the national anthem, those types of things, are protesting civil rights, however you want to look at it. So it's something that hasn't been solved to this day. Now, I'm going to give you 7 examples of the inequality between blacks and whites in the early 1950s. Things you may not even be aware of, but I think you are simply by some of the things we have here. What did you have in the early 1950s? You had segregated schools. So if you were black, you had to go to an all-black school. Okay? You know, we used to have that in Orland. Did you know that? The school that's down by the gas station down there, there was the highway patrolman building at one time. That was a school that only Mexican kids went to, Hispanic kids. That was, no offense, the Mexican school. That's where you went. These principals in these schools would not allow Hispanic or Mexican kids to come to their school. They all went to that school, right here in Orland. And that wasn't in the 50s. That was even later than that. So you had segregated schools. You had segregated bathrooms. And we've got some signs up there that kind of show you that type of thing. Where not only wouldn't happen in schools because schools were segregated, but in businesses there was a bathroom for blacks and a bathroom for whites. Okay? There wasn't a bathroom for Hispanics, and a bathroom for Asians, and a bathroom for Native Americans, and a bathroom for whites, and a bathroom for blacks. It was whites and blacks at that time. You had segregated drinking fountains. Segregated drinking fountains. Whites used one drinking fountain, blacks used another. You had segregated restaurants. Restaurants that only black people could go to, that they couldn't go to the white restaurants, which led to things called sit-ins, where black people protested by going into the white restaurants and sitting there until they were arrested. Segregated hotels. Segregated hotels. Well, I think I told you this story before. One of the biggest battles for college teams and professional teams in different sports in the 1950s and 60s was finding a place where people could stay together, where you could keep your team together. And we're going to share a story about Ernie Davis, the Express, who was a great college football player for Syracuse, and how he fought that and his teammates fought that. It's an incredible story. Segregated hotels. Segregated bus terminals, where they would have waiting areas in Greyhound bus stations, a waiting area for the blacks and a waiting area for the whites. Segregated bus terminals. I don't mean they had 2 different terminals. They had one terminal, but they sat in different sections. And obviously they had segregated seating on buses. And if a white person got on a bus and wanted the black person's seat, the black person was obligated by law to get up and give the white person their seat. Okay, those are some examples of that. Okay. Now, probably the person that was most responsible for breaking ground on the civil rights issue, that tried to do things the right way, was Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren. Okay? The man that was most responsible for breaking ground on the civil rights issue was Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren. Now, Warren pushed for the desegregation of blacks in America. That stunned the Eisenhower administration. They weren't ready for desegregation. They weren't ready for the fallout and the controversy. They were shocked when Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was appointed by Eisenhower, all of a sudden made it his life's mission to desegregate blacks in America. Now, one of the most historic decisions ever made in the United States concerning the Supreme Court happened during the Earl Warren-led Supreme Court. And that decision came from a lawsuit that became known in history as Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This was a landmark decision made by the Supreme Court. So one of the most historic decisions ever made in America was made during the time Justice Earl Warren led the Supreme Court. And this decision from the Supreme Court came from a lawsuit that became known in American history as Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Now, you can imagine by the title, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that someone sued the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas over segregated schools. Okay? And during this Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. That was a huge decision. It stated basically that all students, black or white, could be and should be schooled together, not separate because of race. So this was a huge landmark decision, absolutely huge. And it shocked the Eisenhower administration. Now, when this Supreme Court decision came out that segregation was unconstitutional or illegal, most of the states in the United States tried to comply with that ruling. But what area of the United States was not so? The deep, especially the Deep South. Very good, Taylor. The Deep South is going to resist for years. And their resistance in the 1950s is going to lead to a ton of upheaval in the 1960s. And we're going to hear more about this. So all those states in the Deep South who were very, very racist at the time would resist this decision by the Supreme Court for years and years and years. And it's going to lead to some real severe problems in the 1960s that we'll talk about later. Okay? Well, that's going to take us to something you've more than likely heard of, the courageous action of Rosa Parks. The courageous action of Rosa Parks. How many in here have heard of Rosa Parks? I mean, I'm sure you all have. Okay? See if you know the story in detail. Well, Negroes were pretty passive prior to Brown versus the Board of Education. They were pretty passive. They didn't resist a whole lot. But once the Supreme Court passed the ruling that segregation was illegal, Negroes began to become more aggressive and began to stand out a little bit more in their viewpoints. And that was probably best demonstrated on December 1st of 1955. December 1st of 1955, when Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old black seamstress, refused to give up her bus seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Okay, on December 1st of 1955, Rosa Parks, who at the time was a 42-year-old black seamstress, refused to give up her bus seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Was she committing a crime by doing that? She was. Under local laws of segregation in Montgomery, Alabama, they arrested her, they charged her, convicted her, and she had to pay a fine of $14 for her actions. Okay? So she was arrested, she was charged, tried, and fined $14 for her actions. Now, at the time of this historic event, there was a young pastor that was serving a local church in Montgomery by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a young pastor at the time, and he was serving in a local church in Montgomery. And he didn't particularly like the situation surrounding Rosa Parks and what happened to her, so he led a peaceful protest in Montgomery. He led a peaceful protest in Montgomery. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., just a young pastor at the time. What he did as a protest to the way Rosa Parks was treated is he leads black citizens of Montgomery on a bus boycott. He leads black citizens in Montgomery on a bus boycott. Now what does that mean, Brady, if we're boycotting buses? You're not going to ride them. So they boycott the buses in Montgomery. Well, this boycott lasts almost 13 months, over a year. All black people are boycotting the buses. Well, a little over a year after Rosa Parks' situation, on December 13th of 1956, the United States Supreme Court makes another ruling that Alabama's state and local policies on segregation are illegal. So all of a sudden now it's not against the law to not give up your seat. So on December 13th of 1956, towards the end of this bus boycott, the United States Supreme Court rules that Alabama state and local laws on segregation are illegal. Why did that happen? Do you think Martin Luther King Jr.'s bus boycott had something to do with that? Sure it did. And the bus companies were losing money because these people made up a big part of their profits by riding the bus. Well, 7 days after that historic decision, on December 20th, Dr. King decided he'd take a bus ride in Montgomery. So he sits right in the front of the bus that's actually marked on the bus, whites only, and sits in that section on the bus. So 7 days after this historic Supreme Court decision that said all of Alabama's state and local laws on segregation are illegal, Dr. Martin Luther King takes a ride on a bus in Montgomery, and he sits right in the front of the bus in a section reserved for whites only. Now, this is a great victory for civil rights, but it also is a great victory for Martin Luther King Jr. because it's this event that pushes him into the national spotlight and will begin his quest to become the greatest civil rights leader in American history. This is where he gets his start, is from this bus boycott during the Eisenhower administration. From this point on, Martin Luther King Jr. will be the face of the civil rights issue for African Americans. Okay, was that a crisis? I mean, did anybody get beat up over that bus boycott, or do you have any police issues? No, it was simply a peaceful boycott. Where Eisenhower is going to get his first crisis concerning civil rights will be our next subtopic, which is Little Rock, Arkansas, and school segregation. Little Rock, Arkansas, and school segregation. Now, as I mentioned, the first real crisis concerning civil rights during the Eisenhower administration is going to occur at a place called Little Rock, Arkansas. Anybody know who did their report on Orville Faubus? Anybody do a report on him, a biography? Yeah, I thought you did. Who is that guy?
He worked for the government in Arkansas, and was he mayor?
He was the governor.
And he tried to was like desegregating schools, and like that's what his goal was in the end. But it was mostly bus.
Well, actually, it was just the opposite. He was for the total segregation.
He said it was desegregation.
Well, then you might check it out, because in 1957, he would not allow 9 Negro students to enroll at Little Rock Central High School. I think you just got your segregation wrong. I think you wrote it right. No, he was very much against desegregation. In 1957, Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas would not allow 9 Negro students to enroll at Little Rock Central High School. Prevented them personally from enrolling. He was so serious about this that he mobilized the Arkansas National Guard to prevent them from enrolling. Okay? Because were the laws in Arkansas, did they state desegregation or segregation at the time? The only way he brings in the National Guard to prevent the students from enrolling is if it's against the law to be together, right? So that's how serious this guy is. So in 1957, Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas would not allow 9 Negro students to enroll at Little Rock Central High School. he mobilized the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the students from enrolling. That's how serious he was. Well, President Eisenhower could not sit back and do nothing. So what Eisenhower did is he sent in military troops to Little Rock and had those military troops escort those 9 Negro students to class. Brought in the military. And the military escorted those students to class. Well, as a result of that crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Now here's what's you talk about ignoring civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1957, kids, was the first passage of any civil rights legislation since Reconstruction after the Civil War. They had not passed one piece of legislation concerning the subject of civil rights since the end of the Civil War during Reconstruction. That's how much it had been ignored. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 established a couple of things here. The first thing the Civil Rights Act of 1957 established was a civil rights division within the Department of Justice. A civil rights division within the Department of Justice. The Justice Department now would have a division just dedicated to ensuring civil rights. That was a huge step. So a civil rights division was put in the Justice Department. And basically what that division did is it prosecuted individuals who denied other individuals the right to vote. Now that might seem stupid to you. You're thinking to yourself, well, what do you mean they denied them the right to vote? We'll get into this. You had white mobs later that would threaten blacks if they went to the polls and voted. And there was no recourse for that. Well, the division, the Civil Rights Division within the Justice Department is going to empower federal officials to prosecute individuals that denied another citizen's right to vote. They were threatening and beating the hell out of these Negroes to keep them from voting, if you can believe that. The second thing the Civil Rights Act of 1957 established was a 6-member Civil Rights Commission. A 6-member Civil Rights Commission. Now this commission basically investigated any allegations of voter infringement. They investigated any allegations of voter infringement. Hunter, what is voter infringement? I know what we talked about in the second one. Preventing somebody from voting, infringing on a person's right to vote. So they took this seriously. One of the biggest issues at the time was Negroes would not go to the polls and vote because of the threat to do so. And so what the Civil Rights Act of 1957 did in essence is it prosecuted people that denied a person's right to vote, and it investigated any allegations of what we call voter infringement. Now, did Eisenhower enforce this new law? He did, because it was a law. But he strongly believed that mere laws aren't going to change people's beliefs that they have within their own hearts. And so in the issue of civil rights, Eisenhower is going to be stand-pattish, which means he's not going to do anything against it, but he's really not going to do anything for it. So he reluctantly enforced the Civil Rights Act of 1957, but he strongly believed that just passing a law is not going to change how people believe about civil rights. You just can't do it that way, okay? Well, that'll take us to the election of 1956. Eisenhower's going to run for a second term here. The election of 1956. What's that? Now this is kind of interesting. There was no drama at either the Republican or Democratic National Convention. The presidential candidates in this election are going to be the same that ran in '52. Who ran for the Republicans, Pete? Eisenhower. Who ran for the Democrats? Anybody remember? who ran for the Democrats. Very good politician, but never won anything. Adlai Stevenson. So again, you're going to have President Eisenhower running for re-election against Adlai Stevenson. Now, who ran with Eisenhower in '52 and won the vice presidency? Richard Nixon. There is going to be a change in the vice presidential nomination for the Democrats. And it was between two men that the Democrats were going to choose as their vice presidential candidate. One of them was Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Anybody do a report on Estes Kefauver of Tennessee? Biography? Somebody did, didn't they? Nobody did? Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. You know who he was competing against for the vice presidential nomination? Anybody want to take a wild guess? Very familiar name in this classroom. Huh? Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts.
Oh, wow.
So, in this Democratic vice presidential race with Adlai Stevenson, it actually was a very close race for the vice presidential nomination between Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee and Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. In the end, Senator Kefauver narrowly edged out Senator Kennedy. And there's a reason why, which I'll tell you at the end of this subtopic. Because that seems unusual. John Kennedy never had any trouble winning any kind of election or getting any nomination. But he did here. He did not win the vice presidential nomination. He lost to Estes Kefauver. Now, the Democrats took a big shot at President Eisenhower once the campaign started.